Ever since Tears of the Kingdom was announced, I wondered how it would change what I thought about Breath of the Wild. Truth be told, when I said that the game was Nintendo's masterpiece in last year's retrospective, I expected it to be a somewhat poorly aged quote, and for the most part, I was right. Tears of the Kingdom fundamentally changed how I look at Breath of the Wild, and before I set out to make my massive Tears of the Kingdom video, I wanted to have another look at its predecessor to talk about this updated opinion. With that said, while this video isn't really about Tears of the Kingdom, I will be referring back to it a lot throughout the video. I've only played through the game once as of this video's scripting process, and that playthrough wasn't through a very critical lens, so for the sake of fairness, I'll be leaving the majority of my opinions on the game out of it, only referring to how the game affects my thoughts on Breath of the Wild. I already have a video on Breath of the Wild based on its own merits, and my future video on Tears of the Kingdom will also be based on its own merits. This video will be the only time I actively set out to compare or contrast the two games. I will also be using this video to amend some of the points in that original Breath of the Wild retrospective I either didn't explain that well, or straight up was wrong about, like how it's the Divine Beast Tamer trials, not whatever the frick I was talking about. I apologize to all Americans who got an aneurysm from the sheer cringe that section offered, specifically referring to the medical fees that you needed to deal with. I take full responsibility for that. Anything not talked about in this video simply means that my thoughts didn't significantly change enough upon this most recent playthrough of Breath of the Wild for me to include it here. I didn't really want to make the video that long since I already have massive script to write for Tears soon anyway. So without further delay, let's go through all my major points from the Breath of the Wild video and talk about what's changed after playing Tears of the Kingdom. Difficulty progression has always been my biggest problem with Breath of the Wild, and after having played the two games back to back, I can confidently say that Tears of the Kingdom makes it an even bigger issue for me here because it is a significant improvement. There are a lot more hearty foods in Breath of the Wild compared to its successor, and since you don't ever have to contend with gloom damage requiring you to bring meals that would reverse its effects, taking up valuable meal slots, it means that Tears of the Kingdom feels a lot harder from the healing side alone. Gloom damage forces you to be more cautious and not just throw yourself at enemies with reckless abandon like I often do in the latter half of Breath of the Wild. Combat feels a lot more bland now due to the lack of fuse. Since you can only rely on the weapons you can find in the world, it means that you don't really have to think about how you want to approach combat nearly as much. Throwing yourself at enemies becomes the best option because of how overpowered you are, which isn't something I can say about Tears. And I'd like to bring something up since I had quite a few people tell me in the comments that there are differences between the AI of red bokoblins and silver bokoblins. My point was never that there were literally no differences, just that the mere act of fighting the two doesn't feel that distinct outside of the silver ones taking more damage since your approach to combat never really changes. I could have worded it better since it sounds like I'm an idiot in the other video, which isn't supposed to be public knowledge. It's something that I always felt, but it's now more than ever now that I've beaten Tears of the Kingdom. Then you have the Sage's Vows, which all feel a lot more balanced than the Champion's abilities. Tulin's Gust is more horizontally based compared to Revali's Gale, so it doesn't feel like it removes the challenge of any vertically based challenges. Sidon's is similar to Daruk's Protection, but only blocks one attack. Yonobo can ram into things, but aiming puts you in a more vulnerable position. Riju's ability is similar to Urbosa's Fury, but it's useless without arrows, and you have to first get over to her to use it. Just in general, having to physically go over to the Sage to use their ability makes you far less likely to rely on them as crutches compared to the champion abilities, even though there's no limit on how many times you can use them before needing to cool down. Minoru is far different from the others, so I won't go into her here. They also help you in fights, which I imagine they did for the less skilled players to have any chance of actually beating the game because holy frick. Even though they are helpful, they don't feel like an automatic win button like the champion's abilities. They are far too overpowered, and they honestly made the game kinda underwhelming this time around. Revali's Gale makes climbing way too easy, even though it helps a ton with the stupid rain. Urbosa's Fury is too much of an instant win button. Mipha's Grace heals you way too much, though I am cool with Daruk's Protection, if only because I suck at parrying lasers. The challenge of the game is reduced a bit with the Sages, but it's far more reasonable than what the champion abilities do. There's a pretty big difference in how Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom approach their stories. Generally, my opinions on Zelda stories don't change after the first couple of playthroughs, and my opinion hasn't changed too much for Breath of the Wild, though I do find it odd with what they choose to not show in the past. In Tears of the Kingdom, they make sure to show you at least parts of important events in the past, whereas in Breath of the Wild, they focus a lot more on showing Zelda's character above all else. Pretty much all of my issues with the story remained consistent even on this playthrough, like not getting to see Link on his own ever, which is made even worse because in Tears of the Kingdom they made him a little more expressive in cutscenes, like in the opening scene where they first approach Ganondorf and he reveals that he knows their names. You can see Link's eyes shift a bit as if he's shocked, even though Zelda blurted it out not even 20 seconds ago, but who cares. Nothing like this ever really happens in Breath of the Wild. The voice acting was also borderline painful to go back to, and while I would still say it's not great due to the poor direction, especially since both games have different voice directors, I feel like I was being a bit too insulting in the original video when I brought that point up, and I would like to apologize for that. Anyway, Sidon sounds a lot more stiff, Riju is less British, Yunobo is even more punchable than I remember, and Zelda feels a lot less dynamic. I also just generally like how she's characterized in Tears a lot more, despite certain things that I won't mention here for the sake of spoilers. I still get why she's written the way she's written in Breath of the Wild, but having her arc being to overcome her insecurities and anxiety just isn't as interesting to me as her journey in Tears of the Kingdom, even though she doesn't really have as much of an arc in that game. And that other thing that I'll complain about when we get to the Tears of the Kingdom video. I'll talk about the story in the dedicated video, so that's all I'll say about it for now. Tears of the Kingdom also has more of a push to do story content in general in comparison to Breath of the Wild. You get the equivalent of Free the Divine Beast mission basically as soon as you complete the tutorial. The first location is right near the spot you land, in comparison to its predecessor where the first location is a sizable distance away. It feels like there's less of a pull to do any story stuff. But at the same time, Tears of the Kingdom has both more story missions and more variety in said story missions. The two games just feel distinct in this way. One is more free-flowing and the other more structured, even though you can still go straight to the final boss as soon as you get the paraglider in both entries. Though with how hard Tears of the Kingdom's final fight can be, it's an even higher skill gauge than what Breath of the Wild had. What's funny about that is Breath of the Wild's narrative doesn't feel as sloppy as its sequel despite being otherwise more free-flowing than it. This is easily what I was most interested in revisiting. Tears of the Kingdom had the seemingly impossible job of making the map feel worth revisiting, and I think they passed with flying colors. And when playing Breath of the Wild, it makes it even more impressive. Outside of the general topography, I think that both games' maps, somehow, feel relatively distinct without being completely unrecognizable. Though Tears of the Kingdom makes Breath of the Wild's map feel way more barren and dull. For the sake of fairness, I will be excluding the skies and the depths from the discussion here. Right off the bat, there's less options to interact with the environment in Breath of the Wild. Tears of the Kingdom encourages a far deeper level of environmental interaction because of Ultra Hand and Fuse, and it makes Breath of the Wild feel extremely basic by comparison. I'll talk about the runes in a bit though, so I'll move on for now. There's interesting stuff to do in the game, but that stuff is spread kind of thinly throughout the map, and after years of playing the game and another entry that densifies said map, it can get a little boring. Tears of the Kingdom is almost bursting with content that's spread fairly evenly throughout the map. It feels like you can't go anywhere without stumbling on a cave or some side quest. There are a few caves in Breath of the Wild, but there are a ton of caves in Tears of the Kingdom that feels like an integral part of the exploration. So many caves, in fact, it'll probably take years and multiple playthroughs for me to visit all of them. I really only went into the ones that housed a shrine, and that's about it. But it's the major differences that don't involve expanding the map that really makes both entries shine. The Elden region is on fire in Breath of the Wild, but not in Tears of the Kingdom. Getting to Goron City with the intense heat, the path to Zora's Domain being under constant rain are both fun challenges exclusive to Breath of the Wild. It's stuff like that which allows both games to feel unique. Getting into Korok Forest is different in both games, even though it's easier to do so in Tears of the Kingdom. Hyrule Castle feels like a completely different location that you have to find different ways of navigating through. It feels more explorative in Breath of the Wild while being a bit more rigid in Tears of the Kingdom. The two tech labs have the really fun task of lighting the furnace outside with a blue flame, and that's something you don't do in Tears of the Kingdom. Then you have the runes, and there are two major things that stuck out to me, though first there's a small thing that Tears does that makes a world of difference in terms of the visuals. Slowly watching a stone drip a drop of liquid for every rune and tower is so freaking lame and boring compared to panning up Link's arm as an energy ball forms that then goes into his hand, or being launched into the air, Link surveying the surrounding landscape with a purpad as an energy line feeds into the tower. It made those moments feel a lot less tedious. Now onto the two major things. First, they aren't that interesting compared to Link's newer abilities. You're telling me that I can only move metal objects and I can't even stick them together or frickin' rotate them? That was the most obnoxious part of returning to Magnesis. You mean to tell me that I can only freeze time and not rewind it? That's so lame! The bombs not being infinite in Tears means that you value them a lot more, and it encourages you to find other ways of breaking rocks. And initially I missed Cryonis, but not only can you create ice platforms via other means, it's also a lot faster and way more fun to build a boat and use that to cross bodies of water. These 4 runes in Breath of the Wild are just fairly basic and get somewhat interesting use throughout the game, but they all feel fairly situational in a sense, compared to the more free-flowing feel of the 4 abilities in its sequel. The second thing I noticed was that Tears of the Kingdom does a much better job at incentivizing you to use all 4 of its main abilities. Cryonis is only useful if you need to cross a body of water and don't happen to see a raft nearby, or if you don't have a Korok leaf. Bombs are used a bit more often, though the application of what you can use bombs for isn't expanded much further than the 2 bomb shrine. Stasis is a little better off, but most of its use pales in comparison to Magnesis. And even Magnesis isn't really that used, considering how few metallic objects there are in the environment in comparison to what's offered in the sequel. I will say that Stasis stands out as the only truly differing ability between both games. It can't really be used in the same applications that Recall can be used in. They're both distinct from one another. Obviously, Recall is way cooler and allows you to cheese way more of the game, but still, it doesn't take away from the fact that it is a substantial difference between the 2 games. Before the game's release, I hoped that Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons would be an evolution of the Divine Beasts, and I got exactly what I was hoping for. But that then begs the question of how the Divine Beasts hold up after going through this game. Turns out the answer is fine, I guess. Like, I wouldn't really say that I dislike them any more than I used to, but there are 2 things I will say. 1, the stuff I've always liked about them stayed about the same, and the stuff I didn't really like that much was just amplified. And 2, my least favorite temple in Tears of the Kingdom is on par with Va Naboris, the best divine beast from the base game. Tears of the Kingdom's weakest offering is just as good as Breath of the Wild's best, which might not be a super popular opinion. I haven't really seen that much discourse surrounding the temples in the game compared to literally everything else for whatever reason. One of the reasons I think the temples are better is because they feel a little more limited. The goal is still to get to the different points marked on your map, but they work a lot better because they don't feel as strictly tied to moving the dungeon around. The core idea of the Divine Beast is so cool, moving these giant robots around to solve puzzles, but getting to the different areas is far too simple. The puzzles don't really feel that connected, it's just a small problem that takes like 5 seconds to solve, before you move on to the next one that also takes like 5 seconds. Though I'm not sure if that's just 6 years of playing this game, or if it's that Tears of the Kingdom just amplified that feeling. I'd say the temples do also feel somewhat disconnected in how their puzzles are, but the central theme of the dungeon is enough to dissuade those feelings. Each of them has a distinct gimmick you need to use to progress, and so while they feel open-ended in their approach, especially the Wind Temple and Water Temple, there's a lot more structure here compared to the Divine Beasts. I find that Vah Rudania actually has the most interesting progression, with you needing to navigate in the dark, but even then that darkness only lasts until you get the map, then it's over. Varuda has the best flow as you slowly make your way to the top, but the ascent is gated only by moving the trunk to the correct place. Vah Meadow is more interesting to solve when not using the main mechanic of tilting the bird, and while Va Naboris is the most fulfilling of these 4, it's only on par with Tears' weakest offering. But why? What is it about the temples that amplifies the negative aspects of the beasts? On paper, they're all less interesting mechanically since they're all static and unmovable. Ultimately, I think it stems from something a bit broader: the puzzles. Before Breath of the Wild's release, the Zelda devs came across a conundrum, a desire to appeal to novice gamers as well as experienced players. The problem was that generally puzzles are designed around finding the correct solution, so it becomes a tricky balance of having finding said solution not be too complicated for the inexperienced, but also not too basic for those looking for a challenge. And so, with a radical shift in design that Breath of the Wild offered, they also thought to rethink how puzzles would be designed and solved. The end goal is to give players a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction when they solve the puzzle, so the idea they came up with was lowering the difficulty of the puzzles while increasing the amount of ways to solve said puzzle. The thing is, Breath of the Wild is nowhere close to Tears of the Kingdom in this regard. Tears of the Kingdom's abilities, specifically Recall and Ultra Hand, lead to a wide variety of different ways to approach puzzle solutions. Watching my little brother play Breath of the Wild shrines is mostly just watching him come to the same conclusion I came to. But with Tears of the Kingdom, I was left agape seeing how bonkers some of the things he came up with were and the fact that they actually worked. Cryonis' best puzzle is locked behind DLC and is otherwise never used for anything remotely interesting. The bombs are likewise only used in an interesting way in a single shrine, and then they are relegated as the Ore Destroyer once more. Stasis' puzzles are either hitting an object out of the way, hitting it only a certain amount, or just freezing an object and not touching it. Magnesis' puzzles are about how you move the metal objects, which is why the electricity puzzles are hands down my favorite in the game. But otherwise, it's not really the most thought-provoking scenarios. The quote-unquote intended solutions are always easy to spot. There are very few times where it feels like I'm doing something in a way that doesn't feel like how the developers set it up. The best puzzles in the game don't even really use the Sheikah Runes, and my favorite shrines also usually only have one solution that you need to figure out. I still love the Twin Memory Shrines. It's a neat idea that utilizes the dueling peaks perfectly. Fateful Stars is one of the best shrines from either game, with a really cryptic yet wonderful puzzle to solve. And the thing with these examples is that it is literally impossible to solve it in any other way. Brute forcing it isn't really going to get you anywhere. Blue Flame is also a really interesting shrine, but I think that a lot of that is that the progression of its central idea of moving a blue flame is so strong that you don't really focus on how easy the majority of the puzzles are. I find that the shrines are generally the same quality across both games, and I really enjoy them, but Tears of the Kingdom is a lot better due to the complete exclusion of the stupid apparatus shrines, which are dumb because forced motion controls and the puzzles are always simple to solve and obnoxious to execute. The replacement of the Test of Strength shrines are legitimately fun, and with maybe one or two exceptions, the blessing shrines feel like they should be blessing shrines. When they first showed off Fuse, I'd hoped that the inevitable Test of Strength shrines would use it to spice them up, but the Proving Grounds went above and beyond, each of them providing a unique and interesting challenge. Plus, with the superior puzzles, it means that the shrines are a lot more fun to actively solve, unlike in Breath of the Wild, despite the puzzle shrines generally being the same quality across both games. Now, there is one thing I wanted to say in terms of positivity here, that being the DLC dungeon. You know, the section of the video that gave people the most aneurysms. I still really like this one. I feel like the disconnected nature of the sections feels a lot more natural here. The progression that the giant cog offers is really interesting, and the puzzles overall are just really solid. Which makes sense given that you need to complete the 4 Divine Beasts and 16 of the more tricky shrines to get to this point, so the challenge feels like it could be more naturally built up to. I honestly like it as much as my second least favorite dungeon from Tears of the Kingdom. Personally, the dungeon bosses in Breath of the Wild all being based on the same general aesthetic of goo monster never really bothered me all that much, though I can see why everyone else had a problem with it. Part of it is probably that, at least in my opinion, the bosses in Zelda have usually been pretty hit or miss. The hits really hitting, and the misses really missing. The 4 Blights were legitimately fun bosses, even if some were weaker than others, and that overpowered how much they blend in with one another. But Tears of the Kingdom now out, I feel a bit more mixed on them. First off, the music track isn't anywhere near as good as any of the boss music in Tears. I still like it, but man do the themes from the new bosses blow it out of the water. I think in terms of design, the Blights are too open-ended to feel like satisfying fights. All of the temple bosses utilize these sages in interesting ways that makes each of them stand out further than just their attacks. The Arena of the Divine Beast does a lot of the heavy lifting to make the encounters feel different to fight. Fighting them in the Sanctum really feels like you're engaging with a creature that has 4 faces rather than 4 distinct beings. Fireblight especially stands out among the 4 as the lamest dungeon boss from either game, due bombs being far too effective for me to take him seriously. Even more of a shame when taking into account. One thing I will say about them though is that the rematch with them in the Champions Ballad DLC is a pretty satisfying challenge, and does bring their enjoyment up to snuff with what Tears offers. But if Tears of the Kingdom does get DLC that introduces a similar rematch system, then I feel like we'll be back to the whole Blight Ganons are just kinda whatever in comparison thing. Though given that there already is a way to engage with the rematch in-game anyway, I'm not sure if they would do that. Monk Maz Koshia still remains as a pretty good boss that I really enjoy, and it is as good as the bosses from Tears. As for the other bosses, I think my opinion on them hasn't changed too much. Stone Taluses are actually a bit more fun to fight in Breath of the Wild due to the lack of Ascend trivializing the fight, though it does make up for that by making the Moldugas not as much of a joke there. Otherwise, they're all basically the same. Although there is one that has received a massive opinion update, that being Dark Beast Ganon. In the Breath of the Wild video, I said that I actually kinda liked the boss because it was a big spectacle to end the game on, while still acknowledging that it's the worst final boss of any 3D game. I feel like this perspective no longer holds up now that Tears of the Kingdom has been released, because while the final boss in that game is also a big spectacle to end the game on, it's also an actual fun fight that takes effort to beat. It's not super hard, but given the phase right beforehand, I can see why they went with it the way they did. It is a wonderful breather. Calamity Ganon isn't necessarily a pushover, but he isn't really that difficult either. I don't need a breather after him in the same way I do in Tears. What does Dark Beast Ganon really offer? He's not challenging, he doesn't really offer any ability other than aiming while on horseback, and his design isn't really that visually interesting. The final moment when you shoot an arrow into its eye is a wonderful conclusion to the game, but honestly, it's kinda hard to praise it when every 3D Zelda, barring Majora's Mask, which gets off the hook because it was developed in only a year, has made the final blow one of the most satisfying things in the entire game. I know, it's crazy. There's stuff that I actually preferred in Breath of the Wild compared to Tears of the Kingdom. What an insane turn of events. Switching between weapons, shields, and bows feels a lot better since it's an instantaneous thing in comparison to the brief pause that persists throughout Tears. Honestly, I'm not really sure why it does that, though if I had to guess, I'd assume that Fuse has something to do with it. But honestly, it's something so small that it doesn't really matter. There are 2 major things that Breath of the Wild does better that aren't as easily dismissible though. First is that the Sheikah towers are better than the Skyview towers. I like that in Tears they launch you super high into the sky. It does an even better job of getting you into a position to more easily get across the world. But the activation of these towers isn't nearly as satisfying because it's at the bottom. The challenges associated with fixing them can be quite enjoyable, but none of them were nearly as satisfying as getting to the top of the towers in Breath of the Wild. The challenge of getting up to the top of them, especially in regards to the Akala Citadel tower, makes for a more serotonin-based system. The best Skyview tower only manages to capture a little of this. It's not really a little puzzle box area where you need to maneuver your way through the environment in order to find a spot to climb. I wouldn't say that they're a disappointment necessarily, since a lot of the Sky Islands managed to capture what made the Akala Citadel so enjoyable. It's just that Breath of the Wild is better in this regard. The second thing that it surpasses its successor in is the build up to the ending. Now, I do think that the ending itself is far better in Tears of the Kingdom, but the act of reaching that ending is where I have a problem. Gloom's approach is functional, I guess, but the fact that it's really only a mini dungeon is a massive letdown. Hyrule Castle is a wonderful lead up to the final showdown with Calamity Ganon. There's so many different paths to take, and while the waterfalls are maybe a bit too excessive, outside of that, it's just a really solid way to build up to the finale. Especially that moment when as you approach the Sanctum, the sky changes just to add a little bit more flair as you approach. On top of this, Hyrule Castle is this one giant confined area to explore where you can find all sorts of neat stuff, while Gloom's approach doesn't have that much to offer outside of the enemies to fight. Had it not been for the fact that there were a ton of high-level enemies and even a Lionel, I wouldn't even really feel like I was in the area that leads up to the final boss. It's not something that ruins the end or anything, but coming off of Breath of the Wild, which I feel is tied with Twilight Princess as having the best build up to the final boss in the series, it is a pretty big letdown. So, is Breath of the Wild just a glorified tech demo? No, not really. Saying that is like saying that A Link to the Past is just a 2D tech demo of Ocarina of Time, even though I vastly prefer Ocarina. Ultimately, it just downplays what the previous entry did when you say that. Tears of the Kingdom could not be as wonderful of an experience as it is without the foundation of Breath of the Wild. If it wasn't a direct sequel, then a lot of its ideas couldn't have been done, since more time would need to be taken to create an entirely new world, an entirely new art style, etc. Both of these games have their own distinct vibes. Tears of the Kingdom feels like a massive adventure, it's more lively. Breath of the Wild is more lonely and peaceful. One game is about reclaiming the world, while the other is about preventing its downfall. Breath of the Wild was not replaced by any means, even though I vastly prefer Tears of the Kingdom. It's still a masterpiece in the same way Ocarina of Time was, by showing how it is possible to take the typical open world format and make it fun without relying on the fans and the game being held together by scotch tape. I love you, Skyrim, but it's the truth. However, Tears of the Kingdom has made me wonder how I was ever able to put so much time into Breath of the Wild. Tears has so many different puzzle solutions, so many different things you can build with Ultra Hand, a far beefier main quest, and so many more quality shrines that it makes me wonder how on earth I managed to play the game as much as I did without growing bored of it. I'll still replay it in the future, but only as a part 1 to Tears of the Kingdom and nowhere near as frequently as I once did. It's been a fun 6 years, but I think it's time to move on.